Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we get started, take a moment to just get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket, or put on a fan for that soft hum in the background. I always say, this channel is about winding down, slowing down, and letting history carry us into a calm state. And while the stories we tell may be full of drama, mystery, and even sorrow, they're here to soothe you too. So let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us, whether it's late at night in Los Angeles, early morning in London, or somewhere halfway around the world. Wherever you are, thank you for being part of this journey. Tonight, we're stepping into a series of stories that at first might seem unconnected. An aging queen and her mysterious decline, a bitter drink that became a sweet obsession, the sorrowful march of nations forced from their homelands, and a small New England town that fell apart in a storm of accusations. But together, they weave a bigger picture about the human spirit, our fears, our resilience, and the strange ways history leaves marks on the present. These stories aren't just old facts, they're echoes, and when we listen carefully, they still speak to us. So let's begin where the night is darkest and quietest, inside a royal chamber that once bustled with music and laughter, but in its final days fell into silence. The story opens with Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, a woman who had ruled for over 4 decades, outwitted kings, commanded armies, and turned England into a force that shaped the modern world. But here, at the edge of her life, she is no longer the fiery, red-haired queen who rallied troops at Tilbury. She is tired, she is grieving, and she is slipping away. Imagine this Richmond palace in the winter of 1602. The air is cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Outside, the Thames drifts slowly, carrying whispers of a changing era. Inside the palace, tapestries hang heavy on the walls, muffling footsteps, catching the flicker of candlelight. But instead of the lively court that once filled these halls with poetry, music, and debate, there is quiet. Servants move carefully, speaking in hushed tones. Ministers stand nearby, uncertain of what to do. Everyone can sense it. Something is happening to their queen. Elizabeth is almost 70, a remarkable age for anyone in Tudor England, where life was often short and brutal. She has lived through more than most plots, betrayals, wars, and victories. She has survived smallpox, imprisonment, and countless political threats. But now her iron will, the same determination that held England steady through storms, is beginning to crack. Those closest to her notice the change. Her appetite is gone. Her energy, once blazing, is dimmed. She no longer attends council meetings with the same force. She rarely leaves her chambers. It's as though the fire that had burned so brightly within her is flickering low. And yet, her mind is still sharp. She remembers details, speaks with wit when she chooses to, but the spark is inconsistent. She drifts in and out, sometimes silent for hours, sometimes staring into the fireplace, as though seeing something no one else can. Courtiers whisper, though they try to keep it quiet, their sovereign is fading. The long reign of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, may be nearing its end. And with that, an entire dynasty, the Tudors, will come to a close. This is where our story begins tonight, with the enigma of Elizabeth's final days. But before we go too far, it's worth remembering who she was, and why her decline shook not just a court, but an entire nation. Elizabeth was more than a ruler, she was a symbol. To her people, she represented stability after years of turmoil. Her reign had seen England rise, both in confidence and in influence. Her speeches could rouse an army or silence parliament. Her image, painted, powdered, and carefully crafted, was everywhere, stamped into coins, immortalized in portraits. She wasn't just a queen, she was England itself. Now picture that same woman, once so commanding, standing for hours on end, refusing to eat, refusing to lie down, wrapped in heavy silks, her face pale beneath layers of white powder. It's unsettling, it's heartbreaking, and it's mysterious. What exactly was happening to her? Was it grief? Was it sickness? Was it the poison hidden in her own cosmetics? Or was it simply time, pulling her toward its inevitable end? But before we explore those questions in detail, let's set the tone for tonight. The story of Elizabeth's last days is not one of sudden collapse. It's a slow unraveling, a gradual dimming of light, and in that quiet unraveling, we find not just a monarch, but a human being, flawed, burdened, proud, and vulnerable. It is the kind of story that invites us to lean in, to listen carefully, and to remember that even the greatest figures in history are still, at the end of the day, mortal. As we move through this night together, we'll walk alongside Elizabeth in those final days. We'll hear the whispers of her court, the theories of historians, and the strange details that make her decline one of the most puzzling royal mysteries. Then, we'll turn the page and follow the trail of cacao beans across oceans, discover the heartbreaking journeys of native nations, and peer into the haunted streets of Salem. Each story will carry its own weight, but together they remind us of the timeless dance between power and fragility, belief and fear, comfort and sorrow. So, as you settle deeper into your chair, let the rhythm of history wash over you. Close your eyes if you like. Picture the flicker of candles on cold stone walls, the distant sound of the Thames, and the silence of a queen who once filled every hall with her presence. That's where we begin. A queen at the end of her reign, a dynasty at its breaking point, a story that will ripple through centuries. Now let's step closer into her chamber, into the heart of her final winter, where grief, silence, and mystery wrap themselves around the last Tudor queen. The air inside Richmond Palace in the winter of 1602 carried a heavy stillness, the kind of silence that makes even the sound of footsteps feel too loud. Elizabeth I, once the fiery monarch who had captivated Europe, was now nearing her 70th year, and every detail of her appearance reminded those around her of the passing of time. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once a symbol of her vitality, seemed brighter only in contrast to the pallor of her skin beneath. The powdered mask she wore, layers of white lead-based makeup called Venetian ceruse, hid the blemishes but not the truth. Her strength was slipping. For most of her reign, Elizabeth had been larger than life. She had been the woman who turned her unmarried status into a weapon, calling herself wedded to England. She had been the queen who stared down the Spanish Armada and made speeches that stirred the hearts of her soldiers. She had been a symbol of art, poetry, and exploration, surrounding herself with playwrights like Shakespeare and daring adventurers who returned from across the seas with tales of new worlds. To see her now, thinner, quieter, and withdrawn, was like watching the sun set after a long summer's day. The light had not disappeared completely, but its warmth was fading. Her courtiers could sense the shift. They remembered the Elizabeth who filled rooms with her wit, who loved music and dancing, who demanded sharpness and loyalty. That queen rarely appeared anymore. Instead, ministers reported her mood had darkened. She ate very little. She would spend long hours standing, as if afraid to sit or lie down, her eyes fixed on some point only she could see. Servants noted she refused her meals, refused sleep, and dismissed music that once delighted her. It wasn't just old age, they whispered. It was something heavier, something that clung to her spirit. The truth was, Elizabeth carried grief that seemed impossible to shake. Just a year earlier, in 1601, she had signed the death warrant for Robert de Vaux, the Earl of Essex. He had been one of her favourites. Dashing, ambitious, and reckless. Their relationship had been complicated, filled with tension, indulgence, and perhaps even affection. But Essex betrayed her trust, leading a foolish rebellion to seize power. Elizabeth had no choice but to punish him. Treason was treason even when it came from someone she loved. When Essex was executed, something inside her fractured. From that day forward, people noticed the change. Elizabeth, once commanding and sharp, seemed withdrawn. She had always carried herself like a performer, carefully crafting her image to the world, but grief was harder to hide than wrinkles or scars. Some said she carried his portrait in a locket. Others claimed she whispered his name at night. Whether those stories were true or just legends, the sorrow was real. It weighed on her like an anchor, pulling her deeper into silence. But grief wasn't the only burden. Elizabeth had lived a life constantly in the public eye. She had survived plots, faced down foreign threats, and ruled without husband or heir. The pressure of being both monarch and symbol for so long was immense. Now, at the end of her life, that weight was catching up. Ministers pressed her to name a successor, but she resisted. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was fear of letting go. Perhaps it was simply that she wasn't ready to admit her story was ending. In her chamber, lit by flickering candles and cooled by the damp air, the once vibrant queen seemed a shadow of herself. She dismissed her ladies in waiting until only a few remained, leaving her in near solitude. Her silence unnerved them. They tried to comfort her with prayer, with words, with music, but she turned away from it all. To those who watched, it was as if she was staring down something larger than death itself. A lifetime of power, love, and regret catching up with her in those final months. The court, once bustling with pageantry and life, had grown hushed. Ministers waited outside her chambers for news. Servants exchanged worried glances in the corridors. Rumours spread through the palace. The Virgin Queen was failing. Outside, the people of England whispered too, wondering what would come after Elizabeth. The Tudor dynasty, which had shaped the nation for more than a century, was reaching its end. There was no child to inherit the crown, no heir raised at her side. The uncertainty pressed down on everyone, from noblemen to commoners. And still Elizabeth stood, for hours, sometimes all night, refusing to lie down, refusing to rest. To many it seemed symbolic. She had carried England on her shoulders for 44 years. She had outlasted rivals, silenced dissenters, and kept her people together through storms. But now she would not let herself fall, not even into sleep. This is where her final chapter truly begins, a queen facing not a battle or a rebellion, but herself. Her body was aging, her heart was broken, her spirit was caught between defiance and despair, and all around her, the court waited, holding its breath, as their monarch, the woman who had defined an era, slowly faded into history. The shadow of grief weighed on Elizabeth, like a cloak she could not take off. At the heart of that sorrow was the loss of Robert de Villefranche, the Earl of Essex. To understand how deep this wound ran, you have to see who he was in her life, and why his downfall shook her so badly. Essex was not the first man Elizabeth favoured. Far from it. All through her reign, she had surrounded herself with loyal companions and ambitious courtiers. Robert Dudley, her childhood friend and lifelong confidant, had once been the man she leaned on most. When he died, it left a hollow space at her side, and into that space stepped Robert de Villefranche, younger, daring, handsome, and brimming with energy. Elizabeth was in her 60s when Essex came into her life in a meaningful way. He was in his 30s. To some, he was like a son. To others, he was a spark of romance in her twilight years. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. He had a boldness about him, an arrogance that could charm one moment and infuriate the next. He would barge into her chambers uninvited, sometimes catching her without her wig or makeup, something no one else dared do. Yet instead of banishing him, Elizabeth indulged him. She called him Sweet Robin, a nickname full of tenderness. But Essex was reckless. He wanted power, and he wanted it fast. He craved military glory and political authority, and Elizabeth gave him chances. She made him a favourite at court, trusted him with commands, but he often overreached. When he failed in Ireland, his arrogance turned into desperation. Instead of bowing his head, he attempted a coup, gathering followers, marching into London, and trying to seize control. It was clumsy, it was foolish, and it was treason. Elizabeth had faced betrayals before. She had seen plots against her life, conspiracies to overthrow her, even assassination attempts. But this was different. Essex wasn't just a noble with ambition. He was someone she had loved in her own way, someone she had trusted. Signing his death warrant wasn't just a political act, it was a personal one. Imagine the weight of that pen, the knowledge that her signature would lead him to the scaffold. And when the axe fell in 1601, Something inside Elizabeth cracked. The Queen who had stared down enemies, who had spoken boldly at Tilbury, who had carried the weight of a nation with pride. Suddenly she seemed vulnerable. Those around her saw the change. She withdrew. She stopped eating. She grew quieter. It wasn't just the loss of a favourite courtier. It was the death of a connection, the shattering of a bond that had carried her through some of her loneliest years. Stories grew out of this sorrow. Some said she had given Essex a ring, a promise that if he ever returned it to her in his darkest hour, she would spare him. According to legend, he tried to send that ring from the Tower of London, but it never reached her, intercepted by his enemies. And when Elizabeth learned this later, the guilt cut deep, leaving her tormented by what might have been. Whether that story is true or not, it captured the essence of what people saw: a queen haunted by regret. From then on, her court noticed the unravelling. Elizabeth had always been a performer, carefully shaping her image for the world. She wore wigs to hide thinning hair, painted her face to hide scars, and cloaked her body in rich gowns that gave the illusion of agelessness. But grief is harder to disguise. Her eyes lost their spark. Her laughter, once quick and infectious, faded away. The music she adored, the songs and dances that had once filled her chambers, was silenced at her own request. Ministers found her harder to reach. She stopped attending chapel, a shocking move for someone so devoted to her Protestant faith. She neglected paperwork, let documents pile up, and withdrew from the affairs of state. Her silence unsettled everyone. A monarch's word was law, and without her words, the kingdom hung in limbo. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered of long nights when she would stand by the window, staring out over the Thames, unmoving, her lips pressed together as though she were holding back something unspeakable. Some thought she was praying. Others thought she was waiting for forgiveness, for peace, for something beyond what life could give her. What we would now call depression, the Tudors called melancholia. They saw it as a kind of imbalance, a spiritual weakness. But the courtiers didn't need medical terms to recognize it. They could see it plainly. Their queen was grieving, and grief was consuming her. And this grief didn't stay private. It seeped into the kingdom. When the court grew silent, the people outside felt the ripple. Rumours spread the queen was fading, her health was failing, and the Tudor line was nearing its end. The uncertainty was terrifying. Elizabeth had been the only monarch many of them had ever known. She had been a constant in their lives. The thought of her gone, and no clear heir, brought fear of chaos. But inside the palace, the pain was more personal. Ministers tried to coax her back into the world. They begged her to eat. They asked her to speak. They pressed her to name a successor. She refused them all. It was as if she had turned inward, shutting the door to the world. The loss of Essex wasn't just the loss of a man she cared for. It was a reminder of her own loneliness. For all her power, Elizabeth had no husband, no children, no family waiting to comfort her in her final days. She had her crown, her court, and her people. But in that grief, even those felt far away. And so, in the last years of her reign, the Virgin Queen stood not as the triumphant ruler who had faced down the Armada, but as a woman in mourning. Her silence was heavy, her sorrow was visible, and her grief, more than any army or illness, began to break her. Elizabeth had always understood the power of appearances. From the earliest days of her reign, she knew her image was not just about vanity, it was about survival. In a world where rulers were judged by strength, youth, and beauty, she could not afford to look weak. And so every day she put on her armour, not armour of steel, but of powder, paint, and wigs. Her favourite weapon was a cosmetic called Venetian ceruse. To us today it sounds almost unbelievable. White face paint made from vinegar and powdered white lead. But in Elizabeth's time, this chalky paste was the height of noble fashion. It smoothed the skin into a pale, porcelain mask, covering blemishes and scars, giving the illusion of eternal youth. Pale skin meant status. It meant you weren't out working in the fields under the sun. It meant power, wealth, and refinement. For Elizabeth, it meant control over how the world saw her. She had good reason to hide behind it. Back in 1562, early in her reign, she nearly died from smallpox. The illness left her with scars on her face. For a queen who was constantly reminded that her marriage prospects and her image mattered, those scars haunted her. Venetian ceruse offered her a way to conceal them, to project the flawless face of Gloriana, the radiant virgin queen. She never abandoned it after that. Every day, layers of the paste were applied, then topped with blush and rouge, creating the familiar image seen in her portraits. But there was a deadly secret hidden in that makeup. White lead is poison. Applied once, maybe nothing would happen. Applied every day for years, it slowly seeped into the skin, into the blood, into the body. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning read like a shadowed version of Elizabeth's final years: weight loss, depression, mood swings, tremors, cognitive decline, and skin lesions. The blackened teeth that contemporaries whispered about. The thinning hair that her wigs concealed. The sores and blemishes hidden beneath powder. What her court may have thought of as old age or grief, modern medicine recognizes as signs of slow poisoning. Elizabeth's face, always painted into that pale mask, may have been both her shield and her undoing. The very thing that kept her image alive might have been killing her all along. And yet, she never gave it up. Vanity played a part, of course, but it was more than vanity. Elizabeth's power had always been tied to performance. She understood that ruling as a woman in a male-dominated world required constant illusion. To look weak was dangerous. To look old was a liability. To look anything less than regal was to invite enemies to test her. So she never allowed the mask to slip. Even as her health declined, even when she could barely stand, she presented herself powdered and adorned, her fiery wigs in place, her jewels gleaming. To her people, she still appeared as the Virgin Queen, ageless and untouchable. To those inside her chamber, the truth was harder to ignore. Beneath the mask, her body was failing. Her hands were thin, her frame shrinking, her strength fading. But still, the makeup went on, day after day, layer upon layer. It was armor, but it was also poison. And perhaps that is the tragedy of Elizabeth's final days. She was a queen who had survived everything: plots, betrayals, wars, even assassination attempts. But the slow, invisible enemy was her own mask, the very tool that had kept her powerful. Her silence could be explained by grief. Her frailty could be explained by age. But the combination of grief, age, and years of exposure to poison created a storm from which she could not escape. The courtiers who saw her near the end described her as pale and restless, with a cough that would not go away, and an aversion to food or drink. Some thought it was pneumonia. Others whispered it was a broken heart. But if we look closely, her symptoms fit a darker picture. Her own cosmetics slowly breaking down her body, day after day. Even so, Elizabeth never let anyone speak of it. She rejected medicine. She dismissed her doctors. She would not be examined closely. She clung to dignity, to control, to the mask. In her silence, she seemed to say, "I am still your queen. I will not show weakness. I will not show fear." And yet, behind that mask, she was human, aging, grieving, poisoned, and tired. As winter gave way to early spring, Elizabeth's chamber became a place of unease. Servants whispered that she was not simply ill, but somehow resisting the natural order of things. What unsettled them most wasn't just her frailty. It was her refusal to do the simplest of things: to eat, to drink, to rest. For hours upon hours, she would stand. Imagine a woman in her late 60s, cloaked in black, refusing to sit down, even as her legs trembled beneath her. She leaned on cushions, pressed her hands against a chair, stared out a window. But she would not lie down. Those closest to her said it was as if she believed that lying down meant surrendering, as if closing her eyes would mean she would never open them again. It's a haunting picture. A queen who had stared down the Spanish Armada, who had held her nation together in the face of religious wars, who had outlived all her rivals, now standing in her chamber, fighting the simple act of sleep. She wasn't afraid of battle, she wasn't afraid of enemies, but she seemed terrified of letting go. Her ministers grew desperate. They urged her to eat. They brought her trays of food, soups, breads, delicate meats. She waved them away. They tried music, knowing how she had always loved it, hoping a lute or a soft song might lift her spirits. She turned it aside. They offered prayers, whispered words of comfort. She listened in silence, eyes distant, lips sealed. And so the court held its breath. Elizabeth, who had always been the center of attention, the voice that commanded every room, now gave them nothing, not even words. When her counsel pressed her about succession, she answered only with faint gestures or looks they could not interpret. Some claimed she pointed to a portrait of James of Scotland. Others said she shook her head at the mention of heirs. No one knew for certain, and the uncertainty gnawed at them all. It wasn't just the court that feared, it was the kingdom. For over 4 decades, Elizabeth had been their anchor. She was the Virgin Queen, the figure who stood steady through storms. To imagine England without her was to imagine a ship without a captain, a stage without its star. And so, when she stood silently in her chamber, her people felt the silence too. It was as if the whole nation was waiting, holding its breath alongside her. Her refusal to sleep became more than a quirk. It became a symbol. It was defiance, but also exhaustion. Her body was failing, but her will was unbending. Ministers noted she collapsed at times, her strength betraying her. Once, she was found crumpled beside her chair, too weak to cry for help. Her ladies rushed to her, lifted her, begged her to lie in bed. She refused, over and over, until finally, sheer exhaustion forced her into the covers. Even then, it wasn't peace. It was surrender by necessity. She lay there not from comfort, but because she had no choice left. And the room around her grew stiller, darker, heavier. Courtiers gathered in silence, servants wept quietly in corners, ministers waited in dread. There had been no grand farewell speech, no final act of theatre. The Queen who had once lit the stage of Europe, with her words now gave them only silence. She was slipping, not with a roar, but with the quiet fade of a candle burning down to its last inch of wax. And in that silence, the questions pressed heavier. Who would lead England next? Would her wishes, whatever they were, be honoured? Would her death bring peace or chaos? No one knew, and Elizabeth refused to say. She had always been a master of control, shaping her image, her words, her rule. Now, in her final days, she clung to control by giving nothing. It is a strange and haunting thing, the Virgin Queen, once the most eloquent woman in Europe, ending her life with silence, refusing to eat, refusing to drink, refusing to sleep, refusing to speak. A monarch who had built her reign on strength and spectacle, choosing instead to leave the world shrouded in mystery. And so the palace grew quieter, colder. Outside, the Thames flowed on, steady and indifferent. Inside, time seemed to slow. Elizabeth, the Queen who had defined an age, was nearing her end, and all England could do was wait. The final days of Elizabeth I unfolded in a hush so deep it felt like the palace itself was holding its breath. Richmond Palace, once alive with music, laughter, and the constant shuffle of courtiers, now echoed with whispers and the faint rustle of silks. Ministers lingered in corridors. Servants tiptoed past her chamber doors. Everyone knew the truth, the end was close. Elizabeth had ruled England for 44 years, longer than many of her subjects had even been alive. To them, she wasn't just a monarch, she was the constant in a world that often seemed uncertain. She had carried the country through storms, outlasted rivals, and left her mark on everything from politics to poetry. But now she lay in bed, wrapped in heavy cloth, her strength nearly gone. There was no dramatic collapse, no final oration to echo through history. Her decline was slow, almost unbearably so. She stopped eating altogether. Her body, already thin, grew frail. Her skin, pale beneath the powders she had worn for decades, took on a sickly hue. Her hands, once steady and adorned with rings, trembled weakly. Courtiers gathered by her bedside, waiting for words that never came. And in that silence, something heavier than death itself filled the room. Uncertainty. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled for more than a century, was ending with her. Everyone assumed James VI of Scotland would take the crown. becoming James I of England. But without Elizabeth's voice, without her final confirmation, there was fear. Fear of faction, fear of rebellion, fear of the chaos that had marked so many royal successions before. Some say she gestured faintly toward James's portrait. Others insist she whispered dismissive words, refusing to yield her throne even at the very end. The truth, like so much about her, remains uncertain. What is certain is that she offered no grand declaration, no last words to guide her kingdom, just silence. Her refusal to speak was in keeping with her life. Elizabeth had always been a master of performance, controlling how others saw her. Even in death, she refused to give them closure. By staying silent, she remained mysterious, untouchable. She gave nothing away, and perhaps for her, that was the final act of control. On March 24th, 1603, just before dawn it happened. There was no cry, no dramatic gasp, only stillness. Those in the chamber waited, uncertain, until her breathing stopped and her body fell completely still. Then Lady Scrope, one of her most loyal attendants, gently placed a linen cloth over the Queen's face. The reign of Elizabeth I was over. The room was heavy with grief. Some wept quietly, others stood in stunned silence. Outside Richmond Palace was cloaked in shadow. Messengers waited with horses, ready to carry the news north to Scotland. Within hours, word would spread Elizabeth was dead and James was king. The Tudor dynasty had ended and the Stuart line had begun. For those present, the moment was surreal. The Virgin Queen had been the only monarch they had ever known. Her image was stamped on their coins, her speeches memorized, her presence felt in every corner of their lives. To imagine England without her was to imagine an entirely different world. Her passing was not marked by trumpets or ceremony. There was no priest at her side, no last confession. She had refused such rituals. In the end, she died as she had lived, on her own terms, silent, unbending, and enigmatic. And yet, for all her mystery, her death sent a chill across the kingdom. People feared not just the loss of a queen, but the loss of stability. Elizabeth had been the glue that held the realm together. With her gone, no one could be sure what would come next. But the truth is, her legacy was already secure. Her reign had transformed England into a confident, powerful kingdom. Her story had become myth even before her life ended. And in that quiet moment, as the Tudor flame went out, the Elizabethan age entered history, forever remembered as one of England's golden eras. The death of Elizabeth I was not only the end of a monarch's life, it was the closing of an entire age. And though her final moments were quiet, her funeral would become one of the most remarkable ceremonies England had ever seen. It had to be. For Elizabeth wasn't just a queen, she was the last Tudor, the figure who had held her country together for nearly half a century. In the days following her death, Richmond Palace was draped in sorrow. Her body was left, undisturbed at first, her ladies keeping vigil by candlelight, whispering psalms in soft voices. They refused to leave her side, as if abandoning her in death would be a betrayal. Outside the chamber, courtiers moved carefully, still speaking in whispers, as though the Queen might awaken if they disturbed the silence. Messengers carried the news across the realm. Slowly, the people of England began to absorb the truth: Elizabeth was gone. For many, she had been the only ruler they had ever known. Whole generations had been born and grown old under her reign. To them, the world without Elizabeth was unimaginable. It was as if the sun itself had gone dark. Preparations for her funeral began immediately. But this was not the kind of ceremony that could be rushed. Elizabeth had been more than a sovereign. She had been a legend in her own time. Her procession had to reflect not just her power, but the magnitude of an entire era coming to a close. Weeks passed as her body was prepared, her coffin adorned, and plans made for a spectacle unlike any other. On April 28, 1603, more than a month after her death, London gathered to say farewell. The streets were lined with thousands of mourners, nobles in black robes, commoners in simple clothes, clergy, soldiers, and children pressed against their parents' sides. Bells tolled solemnly across the city. There was no cheering, no clapping. only silence broken by muffled sobs and the slow shuffle of feet. Her coffin was draped in rich velvet, resting on a grand hearse drawn by 4 horses. Above it sat an effigy of Elizabeth herself, dressed in royal robes, wearing a crown, orb, and scepter. The likeness was so lifelike that many in the crowd believed it was her body displayed upright, watching over them one final time. Her eyes, carved open in eternal gaze, seemed to look out across her people, serene and untouchable. Behind the hearse marched a long line of mourners nobles of her court, members of parliament, foreign ambassadors, and guards of honor. Every step of the procession echoed the weight of transition. They weren't just burying a queen, they were burying the Tudor dynasty itself. The route led from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. Along the way, crowds stood in hushed reverence. Some wept openly, others simply bowed their heads, holding hands, clutching small tokens or crosses. For many, this was the only queen they had ever known, and her passing was personal. She had been their Gloriana, their virgin queen, their protector and symbol of pride. Now she was gone, and the grief was deep. At Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was laid to rest in the vault beside her half-sister, Mary I. The irony was impossible to ignore. In life, the sisters had been divided. Mary a Catholic queen, Elizabeth a Protestant. Their rivalry had been fierce, their reigns defined by opposite visions for England. Yet in death, they lay side by side. On their tomb, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." It was a symbolic reunion, one that history had never granted them in life. For some, it was a reminder of how fragile divisions could be. For others, it was a statement that in the end, all crowns fade and all rivalries dissolve into silence. As the Abbey's great doors closed and the Queen's coffin was sealed in stone, the Tudor dynasty came to its final rest. Outside, the people of England returned to their lives, but something had shifted. The Elizabethan age, with its triumphs and its contradictions, was over. A new era was dawning under James I, the first Stuart king. Yet Elizabeth's presence lingered. Her portraits still watched from walls. Her speeches echoed in memory. Her image on coins remained in circulation. For years to come, people would look back on her reign as a golden age, an era of exploration, poetry, and strength. The funeral was not just a farewell, it was the beginning of her legend. In death, Elizabeth had achieved what she had always sought in life. She became immortal in memory. Her body was buried, but her story was just beginning to live forever. Long before chocolate bars lined store shelves, before hot cocoa was sipped by fireplaces, before the world even knew the word chocolate, there was cacao. And in the ancient world of Mesoamerica, this strange, bitter bean wasn't just food, it was sacred. It carried weight, not just in flavor but in meaning. To drink cacao was to step closer to the gods. Our journey begins more than 3,000 years ago, deep in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. The people we call the Olmec, one of the earliest great civilizations of the Americas, are believed to have been the first to cultivate the cacao tree. Not much is left of their world, fragments of stone heads, a few scattered artifacts, and echoes of their culture passed down through those who came after. But evidence suggests they used cacao, likely as a bitter drink, perhaps in ceremonies. It was never about sweetness, it was about connection, to the earth, to each other, and to the divine. Later, the Maya took cacao and gave it an even deeper place in their lives. To them, it wasn't just a drink, it was a gift from the gods. According to their myths, cacao was one of the foods used by divine beings to help create humanity itself. Imagine that the very essence of people, shaped from maize and cacao, bound together by sacred intention. It wasn't just nourishment, it was identity. The Maya prepared cacao as a frothy, bitter liquid. They would pour it from one vessel to another, raising the cup high and letting the liquid cascade down, mixing air into the drink until it foamed at the top. That foam was prized. It was the crown of the drink, the mark of its quality. They flavored it with chili peppers, maize, or spices. It was thick, earthy, and powerful, a far cry from the sweetened treat we know today, and it wasn't for everyone. Cacao was consumed by nobles, priests, and warriors. It marked life's most important moments: weddings, coronations, rituals for the dead. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, cacao was shared between bride and groom. When the dead were buried, vessels of cacao were placed with them in their tombs, a gift for the journey into the next world. In Maya art, cacao pods appear carved into stone, painted on pottery, woven into mythology. Gods emerge from the pods. Rulers offer them to the heavens. The tree itself was seen as sacred, its curved branches and brightly colored fruit symbolizing life and abundance. To drink cacao wasn't just refreshment. It was a spiritual act, a way of tasting the divine. Then came the Aztecs, who elevated cacao to an even higher place. Their empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, did not grow cacao itself. The climate was too cool. Instead, they demanded it as tribute from conquered provinces. Tons of beans flowed into the capital, stored in granaries like banks. Each bean had value. A rabbit might cost 10 beans. A turkey, 100. Servants were paid in cacao. Debts were settled with it. To the Aztecs, cacao wasn't just sacred. It was money. But its spiritual power never faded. They called the drink socolal, from which we get the word chocolate. It was a warrior's drink, bitter and spiced, consumed by nobles, priests, and leaders. Commoners were not allowed to drink it. It was fuel for battle, for ceremony, for prophecy. Emperor Montezuma II, it was said, drank as many as 50 cups a day, believing it gave him strength, energy, and even virility. Imagine the scene: golden cups filled with dark, frothy liquid, passed ceremonially to an emperor sitting on his throne. Priests offering cacao to the gods during sacred rituals, merchants counting out beans like coins in a marketplace. Cacao was life. It was wealth. It was power. And yet, for all its importance, Europeans who first encountered it didn't know what to make of it. When Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors arrived in Tenochtitlan in 1519, they watched Montezuma drink his chocolate with awe. But when they tasted it themselves, they found it bitter and strange. No sugar, no sweetness. Just the raw, earthy, spiced brew of another world. Some spat it out, calling it unpalatable. Others were curious, wondering what gave it such value. What they couldn't see at first was the history behind the cup. The centuries of ritual. The connection to gods and ancestors. The way cacao had become the thread binding together religion, economy, and society. For the people of Mesoamerica, cacao wasn't just a crop. It was a universe contained in a bean. That sacredness is where chocolate's story begins. Not in sweetness, not in comfort, but in something deeper. And as we follow the path of cacao across oceans, we'll see how it was transformed, first into a European luxury, then into a global obsession, and finally into a product tied to both joy and injustice. But here, in its birthplace, it was still pure, still bitter, still divine. To the Maya and Aztec peoples, cacao wasn't just food or drink. It was power. It was sacred. And it touched nearly every part of their lives, from the most personal moments to the grandest displays of wealth and authority. For the Maya, cacao was woven into ritual, ceremony, and economy. If you walked through a bustling Maya marketplace centuries ago, you would have seen baskets of cacao beans being traded alongside maize and textiles. A handful of beans could buy you a tamale. A few dozen could buy you a small animal. 100 might get you a turkey. To counterfeit a cacao bean by hollowing it out and filling it with dirt was considered a crime. That's how much value each tiny seed held. But its worth wasn't only practical. It was also spiritual. In the Maya worldview, cacao was a bridge between realms, between the human and the divine, the living and the dead. Vessels of cacao were buried with the dead to nourish them in the afterlife. Cups of it were raised during coronations and marriages, sealing bonds in sacred foam. Priests poured it in offerings, believing its bitterness could open the mind to visions, to prophecy, to communion with the gods. The Aztecs inherited this reverence and magnified it. In Tenochtitlan, cacao wasn't simply a drink for pleasure. It was restricted, a privilege of rank. Nobles, warriors, and priests drank it. Commoners could not. For the ruling class, it was a liquid badge of honor. Warriors consumed it before battle, believing it gave them energy and clarity. Priests sipped it before ceremonies, believing it sharpened the spirit for sacred tasks. And always the foam mattered. The pouring of cacao from one vessel into another wasn't just to mix the drink. It was to create froth. The richer the foam, the more prestigious the drink. A cup crowned with thick bubbles was worthy of emperors. Then there was Montezuma too, the Aztec emperor who, according to Spanish accounts, consumed staggering amounts of cacao daily. Served in golden goblets, his chocolate was spiced with chili, flavored with maize, sometimes even mixed with honey or flowers. To his people, his consumption was not just indulgence. It was a display of vitality, a sign that the gods themselves fueled his rule. But cacao wasn't just a drink or a currency. It was an identity marker. It separated the powerful from the powerless, the divine from the ordinary. Every bean carried both material and symbolic weight. Imagine being a soldier standing in the great capital of Tenochtitlan, watching the emperor drink his chocolate while you counted the beans in your own pouch, knowing that your wages, your very survival, came in the same currency. Or picture a Maya bride and groom, lifting a vessel together and drinking the frothy, bitter liquid as a symbol of union, the taste lingering on their lips as a reminder of divine blessing. For these civilizations, cacao was wealth, worship, and war all wrapped together. It was a drink of gods and kings, a seed that could decide a trade or mark a ritual. It had no sweetness, no sugar to soften it. Its bitterness was part of its power, sharp, intense, unforgettable. And soon, this sacred bean would collide with the ambitions of Europe. Spanish conquistadors would carry it across the ocean, where its bitterness would be transformed with a single ingredient, sugar. That change would spark a revolution in taste, but also in human history, because once chocolate met sugar, it would no longer belong only to the gods and emperors. It would belong to the world, and it would carry with it both joy and sorrow. When cacao first crossed the ocean, it was not greeted with wide smiles. To European palates of the early 1500s, the drink was confusing, almost unpleasant. Bitter, thick, spiced with chili. This was not what they considered indulgent. And yet, they saw how much value it held for the Aztecs. They saw Montezuma sipping cup after cup, nobles treating it as sacred, warriors calling it fuel. So when Hernan Cortes and his men carried cacao back to Spain after the conquest, they brought more than beans. They brought a mystery. At first, the Spanish court treated cacao as an exotic curiosity. Nobles tried the drink, often wrinkling their noses at the bitterness. It was strange, foreign, not easily embraced. But then came the small, almost accidental transformation that would change everything. They added sugar. Sugar was already flowing into Europe from colonies in the Canary Islands and, later, the Caribbean. When it was mixed into the dark, frothy cacao drink, bitterness gave way to sweetness. And with that single adjustment, chocolate became something entirely new. What had once been a warrior's brew of the Aztecs, filled with chili and spice, became a sweet, velvety indulgence for European aristocrats. In Spain, and soon across Europe, the transformation was immediate. The bitter ritual of cacao was reshaped into hot chocolate, sipped from fine porcelain cups, flavored with cinnamon or vanilla. No longer a drink tied to gods and battle, it became a marker of wealth, leisure, and refinement. In the salons of Madrid and Paris, nobles gathered to sip chocolate while discussing politics, philosophy, and gossip. In London, chocolate houses opened, places where men came together to drink, debate, and gamble. The drink was expensive, exotic, and fashionable. To be seen sipping chocolate was to show not only wealth but taste. But behind the sweetness was a darker reality. To meet the growing European demand for cacao and sugar, colonial powers turned to brutal labor systems. Plantations spread across the Americas, where enslaved Africans were forced to plant, harvest, and process the crops. What had once been sacred to the Maya and Aztecs now fueled one of the most cruel systems in human history. The transatlantic slave trade. Still, in Europe, those connections were often ignored. Aristocrats focused on the joy of the drink, not the suffering that produced it. Chocolate became a fashionable obsession. Recipes multiplied, blending cacao with cream, spices, and always sugar. The bitterness of its origins was forgotten, buried beneath layers of sweetness. By the 17th century, chocolate had spread across courts and cities, from Spain to France, England, and beyond. It was no longer strange. It was beloved. Its reputation had changed from foreign and bitter to comforting and luxurious. The same drink that once marked emperors and warriors now warmed the hands of European nobles by candlelight. And yet, even as it delighted, it divided. To some, chocolate was sinful, indulgent, even dangerous. Doctors debated whether it was healthy or harmful. Priests argued about whether it broke religious fasts. But the debate did nothing to slow its rise. Chocolate had arrived in Europe, and there was no going back. From here, its story would only grow larger. Industrial revolutions would change it from liquid to solid, from luxury to everyday treat. But in this first transformation, from bitter brew to sweet obsession, we can see the turning point. Chocolate stopped being sacred, stopped being a ritual of gods and kings, and became something else, a product, a commodity, a pleasure. A simple addition of sugar turned a drink of warriors into a drink of aristocrats. And with it, the world had begun a love affair that has never really ended. As chocolate's sweetness spread through Europe, the taste quickly became irresistible. Kings demanded it at their tables. Aristocrats sipped it in salons, showing off fine porcelain cups and exotic recipes. Merchants saw profits rise as demand climbed. But behind every sip of hot chocolate, every fashionable gathering, was a hidden bitterness, one not of flavor, but of human cost. The truth was this: chocolate's rise was tied to sugar, and together, cacao and sugar fueled one of history's darkest systems. The transatlantic slave trade. Cacao trees are delicate. They grow only in humid, tropical climates, demanding constant attention. Their pods must be cut from branches by hand, split open, and the beans inside carefully fermented, dried, and roasted. Sugarcane is no easier. Tall, thick stalks harvested under a blazing sun, crushed in mills, boiled into crystals. Both crops require endless labor, day after day, season after season. To feed Europe's appetite for sweetened chocolate, colonial powers turned to enslaved Africans, forcing millions across the Atlantic into brutal conditions. On plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and later West Africa, enslaved men, women, and children toiled from dawn until dusk. The work was grueling, the heat relentless, the punishment severe. Families were torn apart, cultures erased, lives shortened by exhaustion and cruelty. Many who labored in cacao and sugar fields never even tasted the sweet drink their suffering produced. Back in Europe, few thought about the hands behind their cups of chocolate. To aristocrats in Paris or Madrid, the bitterness of slavery was far removed from the sweetness in their porcelain mugs. Chocolate was seen as luxury, not tragedy. Its growing demand meant more plantations, more ships crossing the ocean, more lives uprooted. The same drink that had once been sacred in Mesoamerica now carried with it chains, suffering, and blood. And yet, its popularity only grew. In London, chocolate houses became gathering spots for politics, gambling, and intrigue. In Spain, recipes grew more elaborate, mixing chocolate with cream, cinnamon, and sugar until it became a symbol of refinement. The darker truth, that this luxury was built on exploitation, remained largely invisible to those who enjoyed it. By the 1700s, chocolate was no longer just a curiosity. It had become an industry, and like many industries of that era, its foundation rested on forced labor. Ships carried cacao beans and sugar across oceans, part of the infamous triangular trade that moved goods one way and human lives another. The same Europe that celebrated reason and enlightenment often turned a blind eye to the inhumanity fueling its sweetest indulgence. Still, chocolate's allure was too strong to fade. It had transformed from sacred ritual to global commodity, from bitter to sweet, from ceremony to comfort. But in doing so, it carried a paradox. The very drink that once symbolized divine blessing and community now symbolized profit and exploitation. And as we follow chocolate's story forward into the industrial age, we'll see it change again into bars, candies, and treats that reach beyond the wealthy few. But that sweetness will always carry the shadow of how it began, built on the backs of those who never shared in its joy. By the early 1800s, chocolate had already traveled far, from sacred drink of the Maya and Aztecs to a sweetened indulgence of European courts, to a commodity tied to plantations and slavery. But another transformation was waiting, one that would change chocolate forever: the Industrial Revolution. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten invented something revolutionary. He created a hydraulic press that squeezed much of the natural fat, the cacao butter, out of roasted cacao beans. What was left behind was a dry cake that could be ground into a fine powder. This, Dutch cocoa, dissolved easily in water or milk, making chocolate cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce on a large scale. Van Houten's invention did two things at once. It made chocolate more accessible to ordinary people, not just the wealthy elite, and it paved the way for solid chocolate. Until then, chocolate was almost always a drink. But now, with the right blend of cacao butter, sugar, and powder, chocolate could be molded into bars. In 1847, the British company Fry and Sons took the leap. They combined cacao butter, cacao powder, and sugar into a smooth, moldable paste. From this came the world's first modern chocolate bar. For the first time, chocolate could be held in the hand, bitten into, and enjoyed as a solid treat. Other innovators soon followed. In Switzerland during the 1870s, Daniel Peter added condensed milk to the mix, creating the world's first milk chocolate. His friend and rival, Rodolphe Lindt, invented the conching machine, which churned chocolate slowly for hours, smoothing out its texture and giving it the silky, melt-in-your-mouth quality we still crave today. These changes turned chocolate from an expensive luxury into something mass-produced, accessible, and endlessly adaptable. It shifted from the golden cups of kings to the paper-wrapped bars of everyday people. By the late 1800s, chocolate factories were rising across Europe, producing bars, candies, and powders at a scale never seen before. And then came Milton Hershey in the United States. Inspired by the mass production of chocolate in Europe, he built a factory in Pennsylvania that would do for chocolate what Henry Ford would later do for cars. Hershey's milk chocolate was affordable, consistent, and designed for the average American. In 1900, the Hershey bar was born. From there, chocolate became more than just food. It became a symbol. Soldiers carried it in rations during wartime, a reminder of home and comfort. Children traded it on playgrounds. Sweethearts exchanged it on Valentine's Day. Families gave it at Christmas and Easter. Chocolate slipped into every season, every celebration, every corner of life. It was now a product of joy, a piece of comfort you could hold in your hand, a treat that belonged not just to the wealthy, but to everyone. But the paradox remained. Behind the shiny wrappers and sweet taste, much of the cacao still came from the same regions shaped by colonialism and exploitation. The industry had changed, but the workers in distant fields often remained poor, underpaid, and invisible to the world that consumed their labor. Still, the Industrial Revolution had transformed chocolate forever. No longer just a ritual, no longer just a drink, no longer only for nobles. Chocolate had become global. It was on every corner, in every shop, woven into the daily lives of millions. From sacred bean to sweet bar, chocolate's journey had mirrored humanity's own path, full of creativity, ambition, greed, and desire. And as the 20th century dawned, it was poised to become not just a food, but a cultural icon. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was young, restless, and hungry for land. Its population was booming, and settlers looked westward with wide eyes and endless ambition. To many, the open frontier seemed like destiny itself. Fertile fields waiting to be farmed, rivers waiting to be crossed, mountains waiting to be claimed. But there was one truth often ignored in their dreams: that land was not empty, it was home. For centuries, Native American nations had lived on and cared for those lands. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, the 5 civilized tribes, as some called them, had deep roots across the southeastern United States. They had towns, schools, political systems, even written languages. The Cherokee Nation had a constitution modeled after America's own. They published newspapers. They practiced agriculture. Many converted to Christianity. By nearly every measure, they had adapted to life alongside the expanding United States, believing coexistence was possible. But to white settlers and politicians, it was never enough. What they wanted was the land. The soil was rich, perfect for growing cotton, which was becoming the lifeblood of the southern economy. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia only added fuel to the hunger. Pressure mounted. States like Georgia and Alabama passed laws undermining native sovereignty, stripping away rights, and declaring that native lands now belonged to settlers. Into this atmosphere stepped Andrew Jackson. A war hero turned president, Jackson was a fierce advocate for expansion. He believed that native peoples could not coexist with white settlers. To him, removal was not just policy, it was destiny. He famously argued that Native Americans must perish or they must abandon their habitations and wander far into the wilderness. In his mind, the solution was simple: clear them out. On May 28, 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. On paper, it claimed removal would be voluntary, that tribes would exchange their ancestral lands for new territory west of the Mississippi. In reality, it was forced, relentless, and brutal. The vote in Congress had been narrow, passing by just a handful of votes. Even then, some leaders recognized the cruelty hidden in its language. But the law passed, and its impact would be devastating. At first, tribes resisted through words, not weapons. The Cherokee, in particular, fought their case in the courts. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia's 1831, they argued for their sovereignty but were denied standing. A year later, in Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, declaring that states had no right to impose laws on Cherokee territory. For a brief moment, justice seemed possible, but Jackson refused to enforce it. John Marshall has made his decision. He is said to have sneered. No, let him enforce it. The law was ignored. The Cherokees' legal victory meant nothing. Slowly, treaties were signed under pressure. Some were negotiated by small factions who did not speak for their people, but were desperate or deceived. The Treaty of Nuakota, signed in 1835 by a minority of Cherokee leaders, sealed their fate. Despite protests from the majority, the US Senate ratified it by a single vote. By 1838, the deadline for removal had arrived. Federal troops and state militias descended on Cherokee towns and villages. Families were torn from their homes with little warning. Soldiers gave them minutes, sometimes only moments, to gather their belongings. Some left with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Homes were looted, crops left to rot, churches and schools abandoned. More than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up and forced into stockades, makeshift camps where food was scarce, sanitation non-existent, and disease spread quickly. Even before the marches began, hundreds had already died of sickness. For those who remained, the journey west was about to begin. It would become one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears. In the spring of 1838, the soldiers came. Federal troops and state militias moved into Cherokee lands, enforcing the removal order with bayonets and muskets. Families were torn from their homes, sometimes given only minutes to leave. Some weren't allowed to take even the simplest possessions. Quilts, tools, heirlooms, left behind. Livestock wandered through fields that would soon be claimed by strangers. Entire communities vanished in days, pushed into holding camps surrounded by fences and guards. The Cherokee called the journey that followed Nunadal Issenye, the trail where they cried. Today, we know it as the Trail of Tears. It was not one single road, but a network of routes stretching more than 1,000 miles westward, through forests, over mountains, across rivers, into lands they had never seen. The marches began in waves. Some groups were forced out in the summer heat, enduring sweltering camps and sickness before they could even begin. Others were driven west in autumn and winter, walking through rain, mud, and snow with thin clothing and little food. The government promised supplies, wagons, blankets, food, but those promises were often delayed, stolen, or simply never delivered. The suffering was immense. Old men and women collapsed on the roadside. Children shivered in the cold, some carried in their mothers' arms, until both fell from exhaustion. Entire families buried their dead in shallow, unmarked graves along the path. Hunger gnawed constantly. Disease spread quickly. One soldier later admitted that he had seen as many as 20 people die in a single night from pneumonia and exposure. Even leaders suffered. Chief John Ross, who had fought desperately in the courts to protect his people, marched alongside them. His wife, Quatie, gave her only blanket to a sick child one freezing night. She died soon after. Her loss became a symbol of the entire nation's suffering, sacrifice and grief bound together. By the time the last groups arrived in what is now Oklahoma in early 1839, more than 4,000 Cherokee were dead. Nearly 1 in every 4 who began the journey. And they were not the only ones. The Choctaw Creek, Chickasaw and Seminole endured their own forced removals. Each left trails of suffering across the land. A Choctaw chief later called it a trail of tears and death. That phrase, born of grief, became the name history would remember. But the Trail of Tears was not only about loss. It was about survival. Along the path, families carried what they could of their traditions. Songs were sung in soft voices around campfires. Prayers were whispered over the graves of the fallen. Stories were passed from elders to children, even as footsteps trudged on through mud and snow. These small acts of memory and faith became seeds of resilience, carried into the new land where they would have to rebuild. The march westward ended in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. But for those who survived, the struggle was not over. The land was harsh, the climate unfamiliar, the promises of government support often broken. Communities had to start over from nothing. They built new homes, replanted crops, reopened schools, and re-established councils. Out of exile, they began again. And yet, the scars of the journey never healed. Every family had lost someone. Every community carried the memory of hunger, death, and betrayal. The Trail of Tears was more than an event. It was a wound that echoed through generations. To this day, it is remembered not just as a march of sorrow, but as proof of endurance. Against the weight of injustice, the Cherokee and other nations survived. The Trail of Tears stands as a stark reminder progress built on suffering is no progress at all. It asks us to remember not just the miles walked, but the voices silenced along the way and the strength of those who kept walking anyway. In the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place on edge. Tucked into the harsh New England wilderness, it was more than just a scattering of homes and farms. It was a community living under constant pressure. Pressure from the land, from religion, and from one another. These were Puritans, people who believed deeply in God's plan, but also in the presence of the devil. To them, the invisible world was as real as the visible one, and sin could lurk anywhere. Tensions had been building long before the first whispers of witchcraft. Salem Village was poorer and more rural than its neighbor, Salem Town. Rivalries over land money and politics ran deep. Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the village, was a harsh and suspicious man who demanded obedience and stirred conflict in his congregation. Families carried grudges against each other that went back years. Crops had failed. Diseases spread. Native American attacks on the frontier loomed large in memory. To a Puritan mind, these disasters weren't random. They were punishments, warnings that Satan was at work among them. Then, in January of 1692, 2 young girls began to behave strangely. Betty Parris, the minister's daughter, and her cousin Abigail Williams started screaming, thrashing, and contorting their bodies in ways that terrified those who watched. They barked like dogs, hurled objects, and cried out that invisible hands were pinching them. When a local doctor examined them, he gave a chilling verdict. The girls were under an evil hand. In other words, witchcraft. Soon, other girls began showing the same fits, shrieks, spasms, strange visions. And when the community demanded to know who was responsible, the children pointed fingers. The first accused were three women who were easy targets to Tudor, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, Sarah Good, a poor beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a woman who had defied social expectations by marrying her servant. Three women at the margins of society, suddenly branded as witches. The accusations spread like wildfire. Salem's courts, desperate to bring order, accepted a new kind of evidence, spectral evidence. The afflicted claimed to see the spirits of witches tormenting them, pinching, choking, stabbing, all while the accused stood in front of them. To the judges, these invisible assaults were real proof. The more the girls screamed and collapsed, the more certain the court became that witches were among them. What followed was hysteria. Neighbors accused neighbors, husbands accused wives, children accused parents. To question the trials was to risk being accused yourself. Fear fed suspicion, suspicion fed trials, and trials fed the gallows. By summer, the executions began. 19 people were hanged as witches, 14 women and 5 men. All of them proclaimed their innocence to the very end. The most gruesome case was that of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. Refusing to enter a plea, knowing that doing so would allow the court to seize his land, he stayed silent. As punishment, he was pressed beneath heavy stones for 2 days. His last words, according to legend, were defiant, "More weight." As the weeks dragged on, the panic spread beyond Salem. Entire families were torn apart. Prisons overflowed with the accused, some of them children. Pregnant women gave birth in chains. Even the wife of the former governor of Massachusetts was accused. At that point, doubt began to creep in. If women as respected as Rebecca Nurse or families as prominent as the Proctors could be condemned, who was safe? Finally, Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential ministers in New England, spoke out. He warned against the use of spectral evidence, declaring, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned." His words helped turn the tide. By the autumn of 1692, the executions stopped. The court of Oyer and Terminer was disbanded. The fever broke, leaving silence and shame in its place. But the damage was done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, over 100 imprisoned, families shattered, reputations destroyed. Salem was left haunted, not by witches but by its own fear. In the years that followed, some tried to make amends. Judge Samuel Sewall stood before his church in 1697, publicly accepting blame for his role in the trials and asking God's forgiveness. Years later, one of the original accusers, Ann Putnam Jr., admitted her lies and begged her neighbors for mercy. But no apology could erase the scars. The Salem witch trials became a lasting warning. They showed how quickly fear can consume a community, how easily justice can be warped when panic takes the place of reason. Centuries later, people would still use witch hunt as a phrase for mass hysteria and false accusations. The lesson of Salem is that the greatest danger doesn't always come from outside forces. It often comes from within, when fear blinds us and turns us against one another. And so the story of Salem joins the story of Elizabeth's final days, the bitter rise of chocolate, and the sorrowful march of the Trail of Tears. Each tale, so different on the surface, is tied by the same thread: power, fear, resilience, and the human cost of choices. History is never just names and dates. It is voices, struggles, and warnings that echo long after the candles have gone out.